Also, I would like to share with you a plug for our next two upcoming installments of this Lunch and Learn series on ecotourism. We've got one coming up next week, next Tuesday, on branding and marketing. And then the following Tuesday, June 21st, with some stories of people who are launching their own ecotourism businesses. So some sources of inspiration. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. You may notice that you came onto this webinar in mute, and we're going to ask that all of our participants, with the exception of our guest speaker, Melissa Daigle, stay muted throughout the webinar. And that's to make sure that we make the most of the short time that we have together. But I would like to offer that you enter any questions that you have for Melissa into the chat. And at the end of this presentation that Melissa gives us, we will get a chance to have your questions answered, and any that we don't get to, Melissa has graciously agreed to follow up by email to the group to share responses to those questions. Also in a follow-up email, we will be sharing links to the different resources which she'll be mentioning. So, you don't have to worry about trying to jot down some crazy long URL. So we got you covered on that as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Daigle.
Hi, everyone. So let me get my screen shared and the presentation started. Can everyone see it? Thumbs up from awesome. Thank you. So as Emily mentioned, my name is Melissa Daigle. I am one of the staff attorneys here at Louisiana Sea Grant. I've been with Sea Grant for about 14 years, and today I'll be talking about why it's important to have an LLC if you're doing some kind of ecotourism business, and how to go about starting one. And so very broadly, what is an LLC? And so LLC stands for a limited liability company. And the name of it kind of tells you why it's important. So it provides more protection than if you say just had a sole proprietorship or a partnership. But at the same time, it's also easier to set up than a full-on corporation. And so what are the benefits of an LLC? So there are some benefits in regards to liability. So in general, having an LLC will protect your personal assets in the event of a lawsuit against the business. So say you have a business, something happens and someone sues you because, when they were on your boat, there was an accident or something like that. So the members and managers of that LLC, there is a duty to act prudently with good faith and with due diligence. So as long as you are acting in the way that is, in good faith, you're making the best decisions that you can, members will not be held personally liable for the actions they take on behalf of the LLC. So if there is a judgment from a lawsuit, the assets of the business would be available to fulfill that judgment, but your personal assets would not. And this applies to indemnification for judgments, if there's a settlement, penalties, fines, and other expenses of the entity. Unless, and this is a big unless, the individual violated a criminal law. So if you are engaged in any kind of criminal activity, that negates that limitation of liability that is in place with an LLC. There are also some benefits of an LLC in regards to taxation. So in general, LLCs allow for pass-through taxation. And so the business's profits go directly to the LLC owners, who then can claim them on personal tax returns. And this helps prevent double taxation. So the business itself generally is not getting taxed as an entity. So just to note, the LLC will be treated the same for state and federal income tax purposes. So most common, it will be taxed as if it was a partnership. For federal income tax purposes, then it's also taxed that way for state income tax purposes. There are some situations in which it would be taxed as a corporation for federal income tax purposes, and then those same rules would apply for state income tax purposes. I am not a tax professional. I don't even do my own taxes. It's complicated. So I always recommend that you get advice from a licensed tax professional when you're making decisions about, how to set up taxation in your business. So we are focusing on LLCs today, but I do want to point out that there are some other types of business classifications that you can set your business up as in Louisiana. And so the one you're probably most familiar with is a sole proprietorship. And so this is an unincorporated business that's owned and operated by one individual. That owner is entitled to all the profits and is responsible for all of the debts, losses, and other liabilities of that business. It's best suited for really small businesses with low risk. And so, if you're doing something that there really isn't any risk of harm to anyone else or any risk of accidents, that is the best choice. It's not required. You're not required to register a business name with the Secretary of State if you have a sole proprietorship. Now, a partnership is very similar, and this is automatically formed when two people go into business together. And so these partners are personally responsible for business debts of the partnership, and they are entitled to that pass-through taxation. So the profits do go directly to the partners who then claim them on personal tax returns, which again helps avoid that double taxation. So there is something, we're focusing on LLCs. There are LLPs, which are limited liability partnerships. In this situation, partners are personally liable, but only for their own negligence. One partner is not held responsible for the actions of another partner. And this is most commonly used by licensed professionals such as accountants or architects, like those kinds of businesses. There is something called a low profit limited liability company, which is where the primary business purpose is for a charitable reason or an educational benefit rather than for profit. So while there may be some profit, that profit is relatively low, and the main purpose is for either a charity or an educational function. But these cannot be tied to any kind of politically motivated purpose. So, it's not for campaigns, it's not for anything like that. And these are still taxed as an LLC. So just to point out, if you do have like a low profit limited liability company, these are not nonprofits. That is something different. And then finally, corporations. And so corporations are owned by stockholders and managed by a board of directors. The stockholders, directors, and officers of the company are protected from the liabilities of the company, much like the owners and managers of an LLC. But this is generally the best option for when there's multiple owners, lots of owners bringing significant investments to the business. Corporations are more complicated to set up than LLCs. So an LLC is a really good balance between that sole proprietorship and a full-on corporation. So how do you create an LLC in Louisiana? It is not that difficult. There's a lot of really good resources online, and almost everything can be done entirely online through the Louisiana Secretary of State's website. Now, as Emily mentioned, you'll be getting a list of all of the links I have in my presentations and some additional ones. So don't feel like you have to try to write these down and capture them. So GoBiz is our state Secretary of State business website. And that's GEAUX, GoBiz. And so on the following slides, I'm just going to show a really brief overview of how to get started on that website. So when you go to the website, this is what it looks like. And you're going to want to click sign in or create an account. And then the next page will come up and you can either sign in or create an account. And so if you don't have an account yet, you want to go ahead and click that. And it'll ask you for some information, including an email, a password, and then some general information. Now, at this point, you will receive an email to verify your account. And I believe that in some circumstances, you may also receive a text message if you choose to opt in for text messaging from the website. And then it will ask you to create a GoBiz profile where you're going to select either an individual or an organization and fill in your requested information again. And there are some disclaimers that you have to go ahead and select. So this is kind of like just setting up an account. At this point, you haven't opened a business or anything like that. You just have an account. So I recommend, even if you're just kind of thinking about it, go ahead and set up an account and look around the website and see what's there. So once you have your account set up, this is kind of like the landing page or the dashboard. And so this is where you are going to handle all of your business related filings and starting a new business. There is a lot of information on this website, but so I'm going to point out just a couple of key things. So when you click get started, which is what you're going to want to do, you're going to get this list of options that you can choose from. And from there, it will kind of guide you along the way. And so I'm going to talk about the top 3 of them. So if you click the first one, which is basically find resources to help you plan, you're going to put in some information just about, what kind of business, like, what are you thinking? And, it will give you a checklist, which is great, of the next steps that you need to take to get started. It'll also give you some information about what other departments you might want to reach out to. And so you can see in our screenshot here, that we put in like a fisheries related business, and it came up like, they include like the advice, for advice for your small business, who should you contact? The type of business you have might be regulated by, and they have like Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the United States Coast Guard listed with some contact information. And so I definitely recommend everyone starting here just to get that checklist and kind of see what they recommend at the beginning. So the second step is to reserve a new business name. And so when you click on this, this is when you kind of have to make that first official decision, which is what kind of business you will be starting, in addition to letting them know what the name will be. And so you can see here the list of businesses that I went over. And so that's why I included that, just so that way when you get to this screen, you kind of have an idea of what the other types of businesses are that you can pick from. And then this third one, register a Louisiana business just starting up. So this is if you are just starting an ecotourism business, you're going to click on this one and it's going to ask you lots of questions. So this is where you're really kind of putting in all the information about your business, including, do you have employees? Are you subject to certain taxes? What is the legal name of your business? And your FEIN, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Now you can see on this list, there are some other things that you can click on. So if you already have a business in another state and you want to have it in this state as well, to do business in Louisiana for the first time, there's an option for that. If you have a business that is already created and you want to register it, or if you want to, maybe dissolve the business or register a trademark, those are all options on this list that you can do. But those first 3 are the main 3 for getting started with an LLC. So a couple things to be aware of as you're going through the application and you're turning things in. These are the things that kind of trip people up. And so things to be aware of. An FEIN is your Federal Employer Identification Number. This is basically a Social Security number for your business. And the IRS uses this number to kind of track your tax activity. It's also connected to setting up accounts for unemployment or employee insurance. And it is only mandatory if you have employees. So if you don't have employees, you don't have to apply for it. I recommend that you do, because you don't know when you may have to hire some additional help, and it would be good to have that just ready to go and be used to using it. But if you don't have it, you do have to use your personal Social Security number. So that's another good reason to kind of separate the two. Go ahead and get that federal identification number for the business that is separate from and different from your Social Security number. You apply for this number online, and you want to go ahead and maybe have this ready when you're going through the starting a business on the GoBiz website. And there is a link that you can apply for that FEIN online and take care of everything digitally. Another thing to be aware of with an LLC, you will have to generate some articles of organization. This is very similar to articles of incorporation if you were a corporation, and you will need these to be filed when you create your LLC. And this can be a little intimidating because what you're trying to do is kind of formalize any decisions about management structure, profit sharing. And this is really important if there is more than one owner. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be that complicated. There are some minimum requirements. So you can see the location of the business, the name of the business, the purpose for forming the company. And so, for example, if my husband was starting a pressure washing company, the purpose would be to, to provide pressure washing services. But you can also put the very generic, maybe engaging in any lawful activity for which limited liability companies may be formed. And that kind of is this blanket generic phrase that is allowed for this form that you can fill out. You have to put a duration. So if you think you will only have this business for 2 years, you can state that, but you can also say perpetual. The business will exist until we decide that the business does not exist anymore. And any other provisions you want to capture. It does have to be notarized, and there is a $100 fee. There is online a form available. So they have it all laid out, basically fill in the blank style where it tells you exactly what to fill in that you can use if you don't want to start from scratch drafting your own articles of organization. And so I definitely encourage you to look at that sample, consider using it, or at least base, if you do want to draft the whole thing, base it off of that because they kind of check all the boxes for you. So another thing to kind of be aware of is that it's going to ask you for an NAICS code, which always makes me think, I guess the acronyms make me think of those crime dramas on TV. But what it actually is the North American Industry Classification System. And this is basically a business classification system. And so it's used by federal agencies in all 3 North American countries to collect information and to publish statistical data regarding our economy and what kind of businesses are starting, what kind of businesses are closing, that kind of thing. And so it will be a series of drop-down boxes. So you're going to start with the sector, and each there's a whole list of sectors. So you're going to want to go through and kind of play around and see where you fit. So you'll choose your sector, and then your subsector, and then your industry group, then a more specific industry, then a more specific industry. And you can see on the sample that we put up that each time you pick one, it adds a number. So you're going to get at the end a code that is going to be approximately 5 to 6 digits, depending on how many of the drop downs you can kind of go down into. And that code that's generated will be the code that you put in on your application to be an LLC. So again, on that example, your main sector, this is a greeting card company, would be information. And then publishing industries, newspaper, books, then other publishers, then greeting card publishers. The thing about this code system is that it is not very easy to figure out from the beginning where you might fall. So it's going to take some kind of playing around. And I encourage, set aside some time to kind of figure out where exactly your type of ecotourism business fits in. And then one more thing to be aware of, annual reports. So once you have your LLC, you are going to have to turn in an annual report. These are due to the Secretary of State and can be filed through the GoBiz website. There is a $30 filing fee, so you'll be paying that fee every year. And there are instructions available online, but generally you need to report any changes to members, or if you have a registered agent, or if the address changes. But you also do have to submit it even if there are no changes to that. So you would just simply say everything is the same, we have had no changes. So I do want to mention insurance. This Lunch and Learn is not on the topic of insurance, but it is a very important aspect of having a small business. And you definitely want to make sure that you purchase the appropriate coverage for your business and any potential losses that may come around. There are some businesses where it is required. For example, charter boat operators under the Louisiana Administrative Code are required to carry a minimum insurance policy, and without that they cannot operate as a charter boat fisherman. And so this is another situation in which I recommend touching base with your accountant or a tax attorney to find out if there are situations if there are specific requirements under the code where you would be required for insurance. In general, if you're talking about vessels, there are 2 main types of insurance: hull and machinery, which is the boat itself and the attached parts, and then protection and indemnity, which is that liability coverage. So it's say if the boat hits something and someone falls out the boat or gets injured, liability coverage would help cover those medical claims. And again, always get insurance advice from a licensed professional that is not me, don't do insurance, but it is very important. And so that was my very brief overview, introduction to LLCs. I'm excited to answer any questions. I'm also here as a resource. So if you want to jot down my contact information, or I'm sure Emily can include that in the follow-up email, definitely reach out to us here at Sea Grant to help you if you have any specific questions. And so Emily and Melissa, I'm going to turn it back over to you guys to facilitate any questions that have come in.
Great. You can still keep sharing your screen just in case people haven't had a chance to write that down yet. But thank you so much for that presentation. That was really informative. And I know that I learned a lot in the last 20 minutes. So thank you. I'm not seeing any questions in our chat just yet, but please feel free to enter in anything you're wondering about right now. And of course, you can always follow up with Melissa later by email. Melissa, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What do you feel like is the most, I guess two questions. What's the most challenging aspect of creating this LLC, of the whole process? And then what's something that you think that people might commonly overlook or forget to do when they're standing up an LLC?
So I can speak from my own personal experience because my husband and I actually created an LLC for pressure washing. So my pressure washing example was real. And the roadblocks that we ran into is, things like that NAICS code. There's very little explanation of what that means or what it's used for. And so figuring out where we fit in that was time consuming. And so, we did reach out to the GoBiz technical help people that they have on staff, and they were helpful. But I think just that sometimes if you've never started a business, the jargon, the language that is used can be confusing. And so, that's why I kind of wanted to point out things like that code and like the identification number for the business. It gets to a question where it says, what is your FEIN number? And it's like, you don't know what that is, right? Or how to get one or where to go. So on the other hand, there's a lot of resources available online. And once you kind of step through it, it becomes, it's not as intimidating as it seems in the beginning. And then the one thing that I think maybe is most overlooked. So I don't know if it's most overlooked, but I think it's important is to make sure you get the insurance bucket kind of filled. And so, and there are companies that will sell different types of business insurances. But just to make sure that, if the LLC has assets like a boat or like, other, if there's land involved in the type of LLC you're doing, you want to make sure that, those are protected by insurance. And so that way there is that, that backup if something does happen, if something does go wrong.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. A question that came to me on the side here is, what do you do if you set up an LLC and you close your business? What's the procedure for that?
So that's actually pretty easy. So there is a form and another fee. So it's just a simple form stating that you're dissolving the business, and you go ahead and submit that. And if you do decide to dissolve the business, it's important to do that because then it lets the state know that, there are no more annual reporting requirements. So they won't be coming after you for stuff like that. It lets them know that, you won't be submitting tax information. You don't have to, submit profits and losses and that kind of thing. And so I do think it's important. Some people may choose to hold on to a business once they've started it. But it does kind of put an end cap on whatever potential business liability may be out there, right? So it kind of formally, closes everything, I guess.
Excellent. That's good to know. I see that we do have a question in the chat. Can you briefly go over what the difference is from an NP and an L3C? What's the margin?
Okay, hold on. Let's see.
Well, Melissa.
Oh, a nonprofit. Okay. So, hi, Polly. So I had to like get the acronym. So I don't know off the top of my head what the margin is, and it might be business dependent. I can pull that up. I'll try to pull up more information on that, and Emily can send it out to the whole group. But the low profit one definitely allows for some profit, but I think it's really about, the main function of it. And so like, I may have a low profit business that is generating t-shirt designs or something where I maybe bring in $50 a month on the side kind of thing. But that is not for an educational purpose. It's not for a charitable purpose. And so that purpose is kind of what's going to play into that too. But I'll look and see if I can find more detailed information. What was provided that I found about them just says that, one is low profit, one is no profit, but they don't kind of say that there's a certain percentage split between, the nonprofit income and the profit income. So I'll dig into that more after the webinar.
Great. We're going to give it another moment for questions. You're going to see in a moment a link for an evaluation survey. So you can provide your feedback about what you've thought about this webinar, or maybe future topics that you might be interested in hearing about. So help us serve you and share your feedback. Also, I would like to give a quick shout out, not only to Melissa Daigle, who gave us an awesome presentation filled with information. And yeah, I'm just always amazed by all the different ins and outs of creating a business that you've shared with us. But also I'd like to thank Melissa Castleberry, who is our Louisiana Sea Grants web coordinator. She is an unsung hero and is making sure that all the links get in all the right places for this webinar, and also manning the chat function. So thank you very much to both of the Melissas.